Ladies and gentlemen, and especially all the Nuffield scholars, both past and future, for this coming year, thank you so much for this very kind invitation to come and address you for the George Wilson oration. And thank you particularly Jane and Andrew and the organising committee for making this possible. George Wilson was the founding chairman of the Australian Nuffield Farming Scholars Association when the organisation was started, I think in 1976. He brought this to Australia after what I would say would be life-changing experiences with the Nuffield Foundation in the UK back in 1952. And so it really is an honour for me to be able to speak particularly in memory of George Wilson, because he clearly has created an organisation that has got not only the thought leaders of agriculture in Australia, but actually has got something of great global reach, as we heard from some of the discussion and talks today. Now, I hope in my discourse to convince you that farmers, growers and agricultural business leaders, that you are actually doing the most important job in the world. Now, if you already know that, you'll be forgiven for dropping off or even stepping out to the bar for a few minutes, but it is a job that has always been important, indeed vital. But it's not always been receiving the recognition that it deserves. However, as we move into the mid-21st century, your job, our jobs, will be crucial to human life, our prosperity, and even national and international security, as I'll describe. Norman Borlaug, the Nobel laureate and father of the Green Revolution, captured this idea very well with many statements, but here's just one of them. Without food, man can live at most but a few weeks. Without it, all other components of social justice are meaningless. Food insecurity for any extended period it results in major social unrest. You probably don't know, but I'm actually Irish by birth. Now, we were told this morning to beware of the Irish because they lead you astray. But my Irish ancestors, along with a million others, made their way to America in the late 19th century, and that was due to the potato famine. Ireland was never the same as a result of that. In fact, now goes America, but that's a different story. But it also resulted in the Easter Rebellion in 1916 and the creation of the Republic of Ireland. A dramatic effect from something so microscopic as Phytophthora infestans, which causes late blight in potatoes. A disease with literally nation-changing potential. In the 20th century, one of the systemic weaknesses of the Soviet Union, the USSR, was its agriculture. While the USA, Australia and Europe were all reporting bigger yields, better crops, the USSR was cursed year after year with poor harvests. Such an unfair coincidence year after year, rainfall, problems, plant diseases, pests. And it seemed to predispose the largest nation in the world to having to import grain from those bourgeois capitalists in the West. Nikita Khrushchev, who became the General Secretary of the Communist Party during that period, actually believed that hybrid corn held the key to agricultural improvement in the USSR. He followed closely the work of Roswell Garst, the famous US plant breeder. Garst was in contact with Khrushchev, and he used to encourage him in many letters to develop a hybrid breeding program. But the influence of Lysenko, who was the chief agricultural scientist in the USSR at the time, blocked the incorporation of this kind of technology. It was seen as incompatible with the work that Lysenko believed in, which actually turned out to be very Lamarckian and not very Darwinian. Basically, it was based on a fallacy of evolutionary science. Well, it took a while, but eventually As this trend of low adoption rates of technology cut into the Soviet Union, it really brought an end to what we knew as that old Soviet Union. In 1983, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was then the Soviet Minister of Agriculture under Yuri Andropov, he came to Canada on an agricultural tour. And the Minister of Agriculture at the time was a guy called Eugene Whelan. He'd become very good friends with Alexander Yakovlev, who was then the USSR's ambassador in Canada. The reason they were such good friends is because both were passionately interested in agriculture. And Yakovlev connected Gorbachev with Whelan, and they arranged a 3-week tour around Canada for both of the Soviet officials. Gorbachev was visiting farms of 3,000 hectares and more, and he would ask, where are all the farm workers? Typically the answer was, well, at a 3,000 hectare farm he was managed by a family and maybe 4 additional workers. Gorbachev was absolutely amazed by this. At that time in the Soviet Union, about 50% of the Soviet workforce was involved in food production in rural Soviets. So you can see the drastic difference he saw in the agriculture in North America at that time and in Russia. Now, Jean Chrétien, who subsequently became the Prime Minister of Canada, recalled in a memoir in 2013 Gorbachev experiencing Canadian agriculture up close. And I'll just quote from his memoir. At the end of that tour, the Whelans hosted a farewell reception for Gorbachev at their Amherstburg home on the evening of the 19th of May, 1983. But Whelan himself was delayed a little bit in arriving. In what has since been called the walk that changed the world, Yakovlev and Gorbachev took a walk in a nearby orchard, and they strolled around amongst the saplings, and then past fields of corn, soy, and wheat. There and then, they had an earnest discussion and resolved that the old ways of the USSR had to end. According to Yakovlev's own words, this was when perestroika, which is restructuring, became the key phrase of the day, was born. And 80% of its features were covered in that brief time in Whelan's backyard. So let's be clear. Food insecurity affects everything we do. It changes nations. It causes mass migration, the Irish experience. It topples governments, and it provokes wars and conflicts. By contrast, in periods of assured food security, nations grow and thrive. They create, they become educated, the arts and culture flourish, and we begin to focus on important things like our iPods, cosmetic surgery. We have the freedom to think in a much different way. Arguably, technology has always been a driver of agricultural progress. Even in 8000 BC, Neolithic man was selecting plants and animals and beginning to develop new breeds. They were geneticists, they just didn't realize they were. In relation to that period of time, P.J. O'Rourke has quipped, agriculture marked the transition of humans to growing food instead of being food. And in reality, from that time until the 19th century, food production did increase. There was always some technological improvements, but apart from the privileged rich, a large majority were still limited by access and availability to food. And that continued really until the Industrial Revolution. And as the population began to enter an exponential growth phase, the entire relationship between agriculture and society changed. Now, since the beginning of the 20th century, farming has taken on much greater prominence in global trade. In earlier centuries, yes, there was global trade networks, and they were emerging but characterized more by lower volume, high added value products like spices, even opium from the Orient. But large-scale commodity trading in agricultural products took off in the 19th century, in the second half really of the 19th century, driven by the Industrial Revolution and the reduction of cost of transportation. There was a dramatic increase in commodity agricultural trade. For example, the UK began to import from the US and Russia in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. And this was really the commodification of primary agricultural products like wheat, cotton and maize. Now, with this commodification in agriculture and the emergence of what you might call global pricing, one price theory, came pressure to perform and deliver these products with a margin that was economically feasible for farmers to stay in business. And this pressure has been inexorable for farmers ever since globalization began. And it's just as important today as it was a century ago. However, it is important to examine just how agriculture has risen to all of these challenges. And to illustrate this, I want you to consider the work of Rothamsted Research in the UK that Jane mentioned, and I was previously the chief executive of the Institute before my move here to Australia. Now, Rothamsted was founded in 1843. It was actually founded 20 years before Mendel even published his paper on the laws of genetics. And it was founded by, what? Well, an entrepreneurial farmer. Must ring a bell to many of you in the room. Sir John Bennett Laws. He was very interested in plant productivity, and Laws had noticed that on many soils, bone meal, taken from the slaughterhouses, just animal bones, improved the yields of many crops. He linked this to the release of phosphate from the bones, but he also realized that these bones were not degraded very rapidly on the soil. And so he tried an experiment in which he dissolved bones from the slaughterhouse in sulfuric acid, and he created what we now know as superphosphate fertilizer. Now, that was patented and sold actually as Laws Chemical Manures. And Laws made a fortune with this product. He was definitely the Bill Gates of agriculture in his day. But he decided to invest the profits from this agricultural research back into the profits of this new product into agricultural research. And in 1843, he founded the Laws Agricultural Trust in order to create Rothamsted as a research institute. Now, his first research projects remain today as the longest running agricultural experiments in the world. And the graph that you see up here, I'm just going to talk about very briefly. He created 2 important experiments, broad bulk experiment, which is a continuous wheat growth experiment, and another one, park grass experiment, which is pasture grasses. And if we take a composite of the data that's been extracted from the broad bulk experiment since its inception in 1843, it is actually a chronicle of the most important factors in crop production over the past 170 years. And this is a graph, composite graph of the results of the broad bulk experiment. What you can really see is from its inception to about the end of the Second World War, the yields were pretty flat. They oscillated essentially between 2 and 2.5 tons per hectare. If you didn't add fertilizer, you can see it was roughly oscillating at about 1 to 1.5 tons per hectare. Incidentally, that's just by comparison, that is the average yield of cereal crops in Africa right now. 1 to 1.5 tons per hectare. But you can see what happened. So around about 1940 to 45, we begin to see a change in this graph. And if you look at the arrows, it indicates technological intervention, one after another, decade after decade, has changed the slope of that graph very substantially. So that we went from 2 to 2.5 tonnes per hectare for a very long period, up to what is now 9 tonnes per hectare on a routine basis. And that is in fact roughly what the average yield of wheat is in the UK at the moment. So it wasn't all just about genetics. Most of these wheat crops here, even though the genetics were changed, were not yielding any more. We hadn't released the full potential of those genetics until these other interventions. And those interventions included liming, the invention of herbicides, fungicides, semi-dwarf varieties, many different interventions in order to get to that point. A similar story is actually true of the corn crop in the US. When George Harrison Shaw of Cold Spring, Harvard, published his first work on hybrid vigor in the early 1900s. It's a discovery that actually still remains unexplained in mechanistic terms, and yet it's given rise to a corn breeding industry, companies the size of Pioneer Hybrid, DeKalb, and Garst Seeds. Well, what is it? It's actually a cycle of investment, discovery, technology transfer, and application, which has resulted in agriculture in the industrialized world delivering an ever-improving yield and providing a solid foundation for the growth of prosperous societies. We got so good at it that actually in some parts of the world, and particularly in Europe, a temporary agricultural surplus, and we achieved those, I think, in the 70s and 80s, governments actually began to think that maybe agriculture was something to discourage. We had all kinds of programs to set aside land to actually avoid growing more crops than we needed. And the assumption was that we'll always be able to access what we need. Very short-sighted and complacent policy was involved there, and in fact the EU's agricultural policies are still mired in some ways with 1970s reasoning, despite the clear evidence that around the world food insecurity is mounting. The world is actually a much more dangerous place where food insecurity affects so many parts of it. Now, warnings of such complacency have been voiced by many people. Sir John Beddington, the former chief scientific advisor in the UK, has expressed the term the perfect storm, and how important it is that we are prepared to meet it. And that perfect storm is really a whole series of factors which this room knows well. The potential for more than 9 billion people on the planet by 2050. The fact that there really isn't an awful lot more arable land going to be available. What we have to deliver is going to have to be delivered on roughly the surface area that we currently have. There are uncertainties around climate change, depending on which part of the world you live in. We are seriously dependent in agriculture on fossil fuels, and they will become more expensive as time goes on. I don't need to tell anybody in this room about the question of water availability, which is obviously always a rate-limiting step for any agricultural production in most parts of Australia. And even with all the pressure to produce more, we still have to consider sustainability and how we ensure that our farming systems allow us to continue to deliver year after year. Over the next 40 to 50 years, if we just look at the next slide, we are actually going to need to grow about as much food as we've ever done since Homo sapiens first invented agriculture. So if you look at the integrals of these two peaks here, if you could just push the slide on again, there and the next one, you can see we are talking about roughly the same amount of production over about the next 50 years. That's an incredible challenge for us. We certainly will need to increase food yields across the world by about 70% and probably more like 100% between now and 2050. How do we do that? Well, I think there is a cycle, what I call a virtuous cycle, that we need to foster and nurture. It starts with investment, just like Sir John Bennett Laws put that money into agricultural research. It involves research and innovation. It involves taking that research and innovation and either educating or transferring that technology. And it also requires good policy and good regulation. If all of those things are working, there will be manifest benefits and a virtuous cycle will be completed. There will be more investment to continue it. But as we've discussed, evidence that technological intervention and innovation have been important factors. It must be backed up by sound public policy and international trading protocols if this whole virtuous cycle is to work. Indeed, in, I would say, the last 20 years, in places where this has stalled, it's been often more about policy and regulation rather than the lack of viable technologies. As I've come here from Europe, I've got to use Europe as an example of policy failure. Today, the prohibition of the widespread use of biotechnology crops in Europe is quite illogical. They've been around now for almost 20 years. It's actually detrimental to EU agriculture, as many farmers in the EU will tell you. It results in greater and greater subsidies to hide the real cost of food production. What isn't generally known is that as an unintended consequence of this kind of regulation, it also puts the EU in the unenviable position of using 1.8 times more pesticide per ton of grain than the US. These policies also affect farmers in Africa because sometimes they're fearful of using modern technology in case it limits their ability to trade with the EU. Oddly enough, this is all compounded by hubris and hypocrisy. The EU actually imports almost 100 million tons of transgenic soybeans each year for its livestock industry. It became such an embarrassing secret that in April 2013, British retailers, Tesco, Morrison, Sainsbury's, Asda, all admitted in a press release that was issued in the same week, but independently from each other, that their pork and chicken producers all used GM soybean. Well, what was the fallout from that? Was it shock and horror? Well, actually, the UK public seemed to completely ignore the news. They were much more interested the day after by a particularly nasty foul on Real Madrid's defender Sergio Ramos in a UEFA Cup League match with Dortmund, and of course the launch of the new Harry Potter movie. Evidence, if ever you needed it, that there is a country that's not in the grip of a food security crisis, at least not yet. So, the 21st century will be a century of transformations in agriculture. We already see much of it already. Many of you are using techniques in precision agriculture that were really unheard of even 15, 20 years ago. But we're only starting in that way. The future of agriculture and precision agriculture will move into robotics and all kinds of remote sensing. Digital agriculture and big data analysis will play a big part in how we manage both our farming practices and also our sustainability. Genetics will become bespoke genetics, where we will define in advance exactly what we need, and there will be a way of actually creating the best animal or the best plant to do that. We will break the C and N barriers, C being carbon, photosynthetic barrier if you like, by making much more potent photosynthesis in our crops, and the N barrier, improving our nitrogen utilization efficiency in crops. We will see a movement from just commodity agriculture to specialty agriculture with high added value products, substantiated nutritional products with claims that will be identity preserved and hopefully grown with a major premium coming back to farmers. And the whole knowledge-based economy will turn what used to be thought of as waste products into profitable products. And we will convert many things that we just consider to be waste and get value from them. So what about the role of Nuffield scholars in this changing world? I think Nuffield scholars are really key players in this virtuous cycle that I've described of investment, innovation, technology transfer, and improved policy. And all of those things together will result in benefits that will stimulate further investment. Nuffield scholars have been routinely early adopters of technology, true innovators based on practical experience, educators and transfer agents for technology around the world. Many Nuffield scholars have graduated to being investors in agriculture and innovation because they've enjoyed some aspects of the economic benefit. And many, of course, have served in government or as policy advisors on agriculture. There's probably no better foundation for young agricultural talent to prepare themselves for an active role in this process than being a Nuffield scholar. Food and agriculture will be at the heart of much of the world's advancement over the next 40 years. Food security will play a major role in world affairs as a foundation for growth and prosperity in the developing world, and it will also be a major market opportunity for those who are at the forefront of productivity. It will also be a focal point for developing more sustainable economies and a more sustainable environment. All of this is going to require ingenuity and creativity. And it's clear to me from the quality of the people at this conference and the atmosphere of innovative thought that's displayed already today that Nuffield scholars will play a leading role in Australia's efforts to deliver food security to the world while building an even more vibrant agricultural economy here in Australia. Thank you.